All right, well, welcome everyone. It's 11 a.m., so I want to go ahead and get us started and jump in. I am Jin Jez. I'm the Executive Director of California Competes. Thank you for joining us for our Building Bridges webinar today. Partnerships between higher education and employers are central to boosting students' post-secondary success, namely their employment outcomes, which strongly relate to so many other quality of life aspects for students. And it also is really important for strengthening workforce outcomes, our state's economy, and ensuring that our communities can thrive. So in this report that was issued today, and in this webinar, we dig in to understand better what are the barriers to higher ed and employers engaging, and then how do we move forward around those barriers. California's diverse and complex higher education and workforce ecosystem make it really tough to build these engagements that are really meaningful. We have a number across our state that are sparks of innovation and success, but how do we seed a system and structures so that this is more the norm than the exception? So today we'll share a bit from our research and hear from a great panel on their insights and experiences around establishing these types of partnerships. So a bit of housekeeping before we jump in. I know we're getting very used to these new webinars, but just as a reminder, we will have a panel and we want to hear from questions from participants. So to submit your questions, click on the Q&A icon on the control panel. That will help us identify the questions. You could also use the chat function to have conversation amongst yourselves, but the Q&A function is where we're going to go to find questions to elevate to the panel. Also, we will share the slides from this webinar and the recording of the webinar. It will be posted on our website and will be sent to everyone who registered to the event. So I'd love to begin by learning more about who joined us for this great discussion today. Our panelists here are stakeholders representing all parts of the education to employment continuum. We have higher ed folks, an employer, a former student on the panel, and California Competes as policy and research. Where do you fall in this higher ed and workforce ecosystem? So a poll will have popped up on your screen. Please take a second and select the option that best represents you or what brought you here today. I know many of you may straddle multiple roles. Take a few seconds to respond. Right, I'm seeing these results. So let's see, it looks like I can share the results. So what we have here is most of the attendees are representing higher education institutions as faculty, staff, administrators. A number of folks in the other group. If you were an otherer, will you put in the chat what brought you here today or what stakeholder group you represent? Researchers, about 13%, followed closely by policy and legislative at 7%, philanthropy at 7%, and employers and industry also represented here. Thank you for joining us. Okay, great. Oh, great. I see folks in the chat filling things in. So onto our agenda for the day, or the webinar, I should say. We'll do welcome introductions briefly. We're going to talk about the brief that we put out, the research brief on why are higher education employer partnerships so important, and talk about the barriers and opportunities we heard from our interviewees. And then we will jump into our panel. So I want to welcome our panelists here today. So we have 4 great panelists representing the spectrum of folks engaged around higher ed and employer engagement. Our higher education leaders and faculty, we have Sandra Sanchez, the Interim Vice Chancellor of Workforce and Economic Development at the California Community College's Chancellor's Office. We have James DeKloe, Professor of Biological Sciences and Biotechnology at Solano Community College, which I went to Solano College and is my hometown. Our recent graduate representative, Colton Maddox, who's an alum of Sacramento State's nursing program and the former director of Health and Human Services for the Associated Students, and our employer representative, Chris Esch, Senior Manager of Security Operations at Q Health, focused on cybersecurity. So thank you for joining us. I will do your longer bios right before the panel, but I wanted to just welcome you here in joining us today. Okay, and for those of you not familiar with California Competes, who are we? We are a higher education policy research and advocacy org, and we aim to solve our state's thorny social and economic problems by conducting rigorous higher education and workforce policy research. We view higher education as both a vaccine and an antidote against economic stagnation and social stratification for individual Californians, our communities, and the state's economy. We believe long-term economic growth for California will be accomplished through shared prosperity. In tackling this, we've identified 4 main policy priorities that are critical to advancing this vision for our state. First on that list is higher education alignment with workforce needs. And the work that you're going to see presented today and the discussion today fits firmly into this category. Related to that and cross-cutting is post-secondary access and success for adults. That our state needs to create better structures, better post-secondary structures that allow Californians who are not part of the traditional straight from high school to college 18-year-old pipeline. How do we restructure higher ed in our state to support the millions of Californians who want to go back to college, and our state needs to go back to college and be successful and complete? Effective and accessible online education is also critical to meeting these needs. More increasingly, adult learners prefer exclusively online. However, what we see in online in California right now is dramatically inequitable outcomes. But we believe at California Competes that it's not if we do online, but how do we do it? And our state must figure it out. And last but not least is coordinated policy setting amongst segments and sectors. This really focuses on how do we pull together the complex and diverse higher education system in California to work together and build off the connective tissue of different efforts. And then how does that better connect to other key parts of our government society, our workforce system, our health and human services, our criminal justice, et cetera. So thinking about how do we coordinate the good policies that are being passed so that they better reach Californians. So thinking about this connection between higher ed and workforce in particular, why are partnerships between higher education and employers important? Well, obviously it's beneficial for the state and its economies, but also for many specific stakeholders represented by our panel today: students, colleges, universities, and employers. For students, these partnerships are key to increasing clarity about educational career pathways, improving their career readiness skills that are needed in the labor market, and ultimately, better job opportunities and outcomes. And this is really critical for first-gen students, students of color, women, those that struggle in a workforce system that is really challenging and where you don't have professional opportunities. I think about myself not knowing anyone with a professional job in my family, my friends, and trying to understand how do you make that step? I completed college, but how do I get a good job? So I think it's really a really critical equity question too. For higher education institutions, a strengthened enrollment pipeline, increasingly students are identifying a better job as the #1 reason for going to college. So if we can make clear to students about how the value proposition of higher education and labor market outcomes, the better we'll do around enrolling students. And frankly, there are public conversations around questioning the value of college. Never has college been returned, more benefits for students than it has today, and the gaps are growing. So I think making this value proposition clear is really critical and will result in strengthened enrollment pipelines. Increased equity in higher education access and success. The students that most need clarity around what will a post-secondary credential get you are those that we need to serve better to close equity gaps. And this is true for all students too. And then also greater clarity for the general public on the value of higher education. This is a battle that seems to be waged on, the front page of media around Why does higher ed matter? And we see this in conversations around student loan debt forgiveness. Who benefits from that? And it should be, frankly, everyone benefits when someone goes to college and completes. And then an optimized ability to serve as a vehicle for economic recovery and mobility for our communities. For employers, the benefits for them are improved access to larger and new cohorts of well-prepared talent. We hear from our employer partners all the time about how challenging it could be to fill open positions and well-paying open positions. Also, increase professional development opportunities for current and future employees. So for the employees that are already in place, that you have better connections to be able to continue training your current workforce. And local and state economies, we can reduce this gap between supply and demand of workers. We'll have more broadly based and stable local and state revenues through more Californians having higher incomes. And we think about this, California state budget, our local budgets are boom and bust. And the last few years have been boom. It's been great, but frankly, we're going to get to the point where we're going to hit a recession. But the stronger we can make the wider we can make shared prosperity a reality, the less volatile our revenues, our state and local revenues will be. And then related to that, a decreased need for social safety net benefits. In the US in particular, we depend so much on employers to provide things like health insurance and like retirement, et cetera. And without people having jobs with those benefits, the government has to step in to support folks. So if we can get people transitioned into good jobs with good benefits, that is less what the state and local governments have to do. And then, of course, increased civic engagement and thriving communities. We know that there is a lot of research that supports people that complete college are more civically engaged, are better able to volunteer, vote, support their communities. Great. So despite the many benefits, it's a struggle to make such engagements a core part of this ecosystem. California's higher ed system is extremely complex with 3 public segments that are not only governed separately, but governed differently, not to mention our large and robust private institutions. And then the complexity of California's businesses. We have, global players. We also have a number of small businesses that employ, I think, most of California's workers. So how do you think about that? And then the regional diversity in our economies too. The Bay Area's economy is very different than the Central Valley. So what works in one region may not work in another. So this work in California is really hard. So we really dug into this, and with the support of College Futures Foundation, we sought to uncover what these issues were and hear from stakeholders on the ground about what's happening. So we released our findings this morning, and the research brief pictured here. And you can see a link to the direct webpage, but you could also just go to our homepage and find it there to click, californiacompetes.org. And it includes a guide that presents the main factors that hinder meaningful higher education and employer engagement as identified by the interviewees, as well as their insights on how to address these obstacles. So what did these interviewees tell us? They identified a plethora of challenges. And when we distilled this down to what are the sort of the structural things that are driving what folks are seeing, we saw 3 main barriers that impede meaningful engagement. And they are misalignment in culture, structures, and values. And to flag that these are cross-cutting, right? Culture drives structures and vice versa, same with values. So with regards to culture, and I will define this, make sure we're all on the same page. We're seeing culture as the learned and shared way of being, behaving, and thinking that influences engagement with external partners. They're formalized and external and organizational structures and processes. And what we learned in our interviews was that post-secondary institutions were not very interested and did not prioritize students' workforce success overall. There was a big focus on what happens within the institution at their time there, but sort of what happens after students left was not a priority or as much of a priority. We also learned the higher education bureaucracy also made it really challenging for engagement to happen, frankly, that employers wanted to move a lot faster. And then when higher ed wouldn't or couldn't, they did it on their own or without higher ed. And I encourage you to read the brief. It's not very long, but you'll get a lot more information around all of these challenges and how they surfaced. Around structures, structures being the policies, procedures, and processes that frame how, which type, and whether partnerships launch, grow, and thrive. The connection of organizational structure and function. So both employers and higher education institutions ideally work together to build and support internal and external structures to help institutionalize partnerships. So it's not just one person, it's not just Jin Jez, a faculty member wanting to do this work, but really how do we make it part of the institutional structure, both the higher ed and the employer. So things that we saw that proved as big barriers around structures were goals, incentives, and perspectives that just didn't align. There were different goals, a lack of shared spaces to connect. And so what we did here was there were some spaces, but they weren't sort of a core part of either institution. A lack of ownership of partnerships. So there may be an individual person who has sort of relationships they've built, but there wasn't sort of an ownership that was part of the institutional structure. A lack of coordination and dependence on individual relationships and the way that sort of spread out amongst sort of undermining then the structural ability to sort of have this work. And then limited resources, both in funding and in time, that also would drive capacity to do the work well. And third were values. So understanding how partnerships will advance and inform a shared goal. And we saw this in three main buckets. One was a lack of understanding of the value of engagement for one's own organization. So for higher ed institutions, a lack of understanding, like what does partnering with employers even get a higher ed institution? And then for employers, what does partnering with a higher institution get the employer? So a lack of understanding the value to the own organization. We also learned about a lack of understanding of what a partnership means for the other partner, meaning higher ed misunderstood or didn't care to try to understand why would an employer what was the value for that other person. And same with employers, not understanding how higher ed works and what values and incentives higher ed institutions have. And then finally, as the inability or lack of clarity around how to communicate and connect around the shared values that exist. So we thought a lot about these core main challenges. But we also heard a lot of good stuff that was happening. So those were the big barriers. They're obviously not universal, but we did hear around some real opportunities to create alignment, insights, things that people are doing. And just to highlight a few on this slide, identifying and building off shared interests and goals. I mean, this feels like a no-brainer, right? You've got to figure out where do your Venn diagrams overlap. What are you guys both wanting to get out of this partnership? That said, what we heard from interviewees was that this rarely happened. So taking the time to figure out, well, what are our shared priorities and goals here? And then how do we advance them in the way that our organizations work? Second, creating multiple roles across campus, particularly for faculty, that include cross-sector engagement responsibilities. And this was really critical because if that single person who holds a relationship leaves, that it doesn't crumble. So you want to be able to have multiple people engaged in an activity, in a partnership on campus. And this also makes the work better, right? So when you collaborate, when you have a partner on your campus or in your job to do the work, you will do better work. And I also want to find that it's core for faculty to be a part of this. We care about this career readiness work because one key part is it deepens learning. So how do we engage faculty? And then faculty are really the experts around what's being learned in the classroom, and then how does that impact the workplace? So it's really important to engage faculty around this work. And then building spaces, and particularly at the regional level and by sector. And that's because of the incredible diversity in our state. Different sectors have, different ways of being, different regions have different priority sectors and different economies. So it's really critical to think about the local and industry specific. And so you want these spaces that spark and nurture engagement between higher education personnel and employers. And so it can be both physical spaces, it can be, you know, a meeting that happens regularly, it could be a conference that's attended by both higher ed and employers, and ideally it's likely a lot of a mix of these things. So one thing that was also clear is there was like no magic bullet, that this work is hard, it's going against big structures and big systems. So as much as you can sort of layer on protects, it protects the engagement and partnerships. All right, so those are just a few highlights. So I encourage you to go to our website and learn more, read the brief, and maybe we can put, if we haven't already, a chat directly to the brief in the chat. That might make it a lot easier for folks to get there. All right, so enough of me talking. I'm excited to turn over to our panel, who are the people on the ground working to improve higher ed and the workforce ecosystem, and will make sort of our economy, our communities, higher ed work better for California's residents, students. So I'm happy to introduce more fully all of our panelists. So Sandra Sanchez, I mentioned, you know, briefly in the beginning, is the Interim Vice Chancellor of Workforce and Economic Development at the California Community College's Chancellor's Office. There, she's responsible for a portfolio of more than 1.2 billion, serving 116 community colleges in our state. She administers programs such as the Strong Workforce Program, the Strong Workforce K-12 program, the California Apprenticeship Initiative, California Adult Ed program, the Federal Perkins 5 program, and more. So prior to going to the Chancellor's Office, she served as a Dean of Academic Affairs and Dean of Workforce and Economic Development at Los Angeles Harbor College. She brings more than 28 years of experience in leadership, staff development, collaborative governance, and project management, both in the public and private sector. And I'm so excited to have her join us, as both the perspective as, you know, being at a campus and being now at the Chancellor's Office, thinking about this at the statewide level. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Next, I'm excited to introduce James DeKloe. He's a professor of biological sciences and biotechnology at Solano Community College, and also serves as the director and founder of the Industrial Biotechnology program there. In the past, he served as the regional director of the Southwest region of BioLink, the nationwide consortium of community and technical colleges that teach biotech. On sabbatical, he worked in the manufacturing department of biotech pioneer Genentech, and also served as a consultant to help biotech giant Amgen redesign the training programs for the biomanufacturing technicians and for their quality assurance associates. He currently serves on the advisory committee for the Explore Education Division of Biorad and on the advisory committees of multiple college and high school biotechnology programs. Thank you for joining us. I'm also excited to have us be joined by Colton Maddox. He's a recent Sacramento State graduate and completed his Bachelor's of Science in Nursing. He served a term as the Director of Health and Human Services for the Associated Students, Inc., which is the official governing body of Sacramento State students. Thank you for joining us, Colton.
Thank you for having me.
And last but not least, I am happy to introduce Chris Esch. He's a Senior Security Operations Manager at Q Health, a San Diego-based healthcare technology company. He's a business-minded IT leader with over 15 years in the cybersecurity space. He's built out and managed various security programs and teams for companies in the e-commerce, retail, finance, government contracting, and now health tech industries. Thank you for joining us, Chris.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
Great. So our research found that the main overarching barriers to effective partnerships between higher ed institutions and employers stem from misalignments in culture, structures, and values. Does this resonate with what you've seen in your work or what you've experienced? Maybe we'll start off with Chris to go first as our representative for employers.
Certainly. So yeah, it's an interesting challenge being in cybersecurity. I've been in cybersecurity since 2001, and I've seen the field really change radically since then. When I first joined, there really weren't any formal programs for training. everybody that I worked with was either transitioning out from another IT role where there were formal, education programs, or they were essentially self-taught, the prototypical hacker, as you would. So early on in my career, I would see a lot of disconnect when it came to getting talent. We would get talent that was very, very knowledgeable, but didn't really fit well in a corporate environment. These are kind of the self-taught people that had all the technical skills, but would struggle with, some of the soft skills or the things that you just naturally pick up in college, like, strong written communication, the ability to meet deadlines. Even things as basic as showing up to meetings on time was really a challenge in those early days. As we've transitioned over, and now I've started to see more and more dedicated cybersecurity programs, over the last 3 years, I've been interacting more with fresh or recent graduates that are coming out with a dedicated cybersecurity degree or cybersecurity background. The challenge I've had there is I don't think it's specific to cybersecurity. It's probably other employers can relate to this as well. We're seeing people with kind of a high level of general knowledge, but they don't necessarily have the specific actionable skills I need to bring them in. So I'm looking at a large training burden going in. So because of this, you mentioned earlier that I've built a number of teams, and my skill has always tended toward being able to build up teams, but my passion has really been looking for diversity and kind of identifying and developing the next generation of leaders. So I think there is a disconnect. Jin, you had mentioned growing up, you really didn't know anybody was in a professional, kind of a professional role that you could look to or ask questions to, or try and find an entry point into that. I've kind of had the same problem in reverse, where my whole career as a hiring manager, I've really never known even who to talk to in the education field, or how to bring this, how to bridge that gap. I know there's a tremendous amount of talent within California, a tremendous amount of diversity. And specifically for cybersecurity, diversity is huge for me, because so much of what we do involves kind of thinking outside of the mainstream. So diversity of thought, diversity of background. Everybody on my team has a different, a different idea of how they view risk, a different idea of what their risk appetites are, a different idea of how to mitigate that risk. Taking that from their personal lives, bringing it in, and having a diversity of opinion just makes us a stronger team. So I think that, to me, kind of the communication and that lack of a perceived lack of a bridge between both has really been a pain point for me.
Thank you for sharing that. I think the equity piece sometimes can get lost as we talk about, workforce generally or employers generally, but it's really key. And I think a key part of what drives this work. And we'll continue maybe just going reverse to introductions. Colton, how about you?
Yes, well, I can only really speak to the student perspective. And I think one of the biggest barriers for students that I've worked with, myself as a student speaking, is the structures, more so the values, more so of the culture. Really the structures is kind of a big barrier for students. I think certain colleges do it really well. Sacramento State is considered an anchor university. A lot of my work in student government was focused on building relationships between students on campus and in the community. That's something that nursing definitely excels in. The nursing program, apart from our clinicals at the hospitals, which are the same employers that are going to hire us in the future, hopefully, they also provide internship opportunities at these same facilities over summer when you're not in school. I think the nursing program offers a lot of great opportunities for students. Nursing is so hands-on, and really that learning is hands-on, and so is a lot of other fields as well. So I think inherently nursing has always excelled in that, trying to get students more experience hands-on. But I think other areas could definitely learn from these successful programs going on. How do you outreach to these hospitals? Where is the benefit for those students and the employer, as has been mentioned earlier? And I think that's the greatest way that we can help our students.
Yeah, thank you for that. The structures, the required clinical placements in nursing programs obviously require higher ed employers to connect to make those happen. Jim, how about you? I feel like it's exciting particularly to have you here, because you have obviously the role as a faculty member, which are so key to this, but oftentimes perhaps not included in these efforts. And obviously very deep industry experience and leading these programs too.
Thank you very much. I thought that I'd share my experience. So 25 years ago, I started our industrial biotechnology program. So we have our 25th anniversary this year. And this was done in response to Genentech's announcement that they were going to build the largest biomanufacturing facility of its type in the world in our county. And so I went to meet with them, and there were biotechnology programs at the time, but they emphasized the skills and knowledge required to go into the research side of biotech. And so I went to Genentech. I said, I'm thinking of starting a biotech program. And I shared what I was intending. They, no. That isn't what we do. What we do is we take the genetically engineered organisms that are produced by research in the Bay Area proper, and then we grow them in giant tanks and trick them to make a protein that serves as the medicine. And then we take that protein and isolate it to purity. And so what you need to do is have students do that, have students know how to run a fermenter and know how to run chromatography columns. And all of this, what's essential is the students have to know regulation of pharmaceutical manufacturing by the Food and Drug Administration. They have to know quality control, quality assurance. And I was writing all these on my hands. Yes, FDA, SOPs, QA, QC, TQM. And then when I went to talk to the next company and I said, you know what we're thinking about? We're thinking about incorporating the people I were talking to would visibly change their posture. And so we, with industry, we developed a program that for the first time taught the skills and knowledge required to go into the manufacturing sector of biotech rather than in the research side. And Genentech announced me, invited me to go down to their San Francisco facility and work in manufacturing for a year to interact with subject matter experts. And I estimate that I talked to 66 subject matter experts in order to craft the curriculum. And then later on, we had the opportunity when the state legislature authorized community colleges to offer bachelor's degree, it was natural for us to apply in biomanufacturing. And so what we've done then is created a education pathway that goes from articulate high school programs. We have 3 certificates, add general education, it's an associate's degree, seamlessly into our bachelor's degree. And then we've negotiated with 6 different graduate schools, and we're sending students off to get their master's and PhD. So a complete educational pathway from high school through PhD with multiple entry and exit points. And we couldn't have done it without our corporate partners.
Wow, that's inspiring. I have more questions that I will follow up with you on in a second. I'd love to hear, Sandra, from you and your, I feel like both perspective at the statewide, but also having had been at a community college doing this work.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to participate on this panel. You know, as you know, the California Community College system is the largest system of higher education in the world. And so, of course, we're not without our challenges. But, you know, in terms of your question about this, you know, this narrative is something that's very familiar. But I would say in my own personal experience, I had more opportunities to work with the gyms of the world than not. And so just to give you an example, at one of the colleges that I worked at, we worked with the entertainment industry to develop what we call the promo pathway. And the entertainment industry came to us and asked us to design a training program because they were having a lack of diversity and a shortage of employees. They had a senior tsunami happening, folks retiring, and not enough people coming in behind them to fill in those positions. And so we worked very collaboratively with our faculty to design a program that developed a short-term credential that was also mapped to a degree path. But what we learned in that process, and this was very much an aha moment and one that I think happens more often than not, is what we worked to develop with those hiring managers was not in sync with what HR departments were asking. And so what we found is that many of the minimum credential to get into this space was a bachelor's degree. And here we had developed a short-term training program that was designed to fill this gap, but our students couldn't even access those opportunities because they didn't have bachelor's degrees. And so I think that, you know, there are other challenges that get in the way of making this work, but I think when everyone's committed to the work, then you can make it happen. We eventually worked it out with those HR departments, and that program still exists. And it's a very, you know, popular and program on Santa Monica's campus. But I think one of the questions that came to my mind as I was, you know, preparing for this was, perhaps we need to change this narrative and think, are we asking the right questions? I think this is really, are we really focused on what the needs of our students are and what the needs of employees are? You know, so how do we move beyond the needs of the institutions and the needs of the employers, and to think about what is actually helpful to our students and to employees as we're coming into this space of a shortage of workers and a shortage, an enrollment decline. And so how do we work together to solve this problem? But I also think that it really does depend where you are in our state, in how flexible and the willingness to participate, but both on the employer and actually the staff capacity of the colleges within our system. You know, employers aren't the only ones suffering from an employee shortage, so are colleges. And so it's everywhere, right? And so I think what I'd like us to do more of is work together to solve both our issues, right? Not so much pointing the finger at anyone, but really trying to understand that this is a common problem that has solutions, and we need to bring those solutions to the table.
Great, thank you for that. And I want to encourage folks to put questions into the Q&A. I will keep my eye on that also, and I will elevate those as they could jump in, respond to each other's comments. Just feel free to unmute and hop in. My next question is, have you seen, or do you anticipate that could help bridge this, you know, create a bridge between higher ed employees that serve students and, you know, grow the help our economy?
Maybe I can jump in here. Remember that workforce development is economic development. And so what I've been working with our local community and with California is to try to bring more biotech companies to the state. And there's intense competition with other states to try to attract these companies that have high-paying jobs and that are socially responsible. And we are in a competition, and what California has to offer these companies is talent. Our higher education system is second to none in the world, and what we offer these companies, come to California, we can provide a workforce. And so I wanted to really emphasize the relationship between economic development and workforce development. Also, I'd like to emphasize that this is equity work. There's no more powerful equity force than taking someone from a modest background and putting them in a career, not a job, but a career with upward mobility. And once you do that, it's multi-generational, that someone coming out of poverty who gets higher education, the chances are their family are going to continue in higher education and continue in a high-paying career. And so this, to me, is the most important equity work that we can do.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. You know, one of the things, James, when you were speaking earlier about the program you built, it was really resonating with me because that's exactly, I think, the challenges that I have faced on the cybersecurity side. Working for a biotech now, and this is my first time in the biotech sphere, but the piece I think that was most relevant to me was you said you weren't training people to be in the research field, you were training them to be in manufacture. Tremendous amount of manufacturing jobs that we have just at our company that I know they struggle to fill. And there's got to be somebody, or maybe there isn't, but if there's somebody doing a similar program for cybersecurity, how can I as an employer find those people? How do we bridge those gaps? Because what you described is exactly what I'm looking for just in the IT field, but I think it's got to be universal across all fields, really.
One thing that we've done is we have set up a statewide consortium out of Sandra's office for biotech. And so the biotech faculty in California, we really meet over Zoom once a week. And likewise, there is a national consortium of biotech faculty. So I know everyone who teaches biotech really in every state in the United States. And we exchange curriculum ideas, we exchange what's going on in your region, what's your best teaching practices, and then we have partnered with national organizations, especially the manufacturing institutes in biotech. It's mainly the National Institute for Innovation and Manufacture of Biologics, NIMBLE, out of the Department of Commerce, and also BioMade, which is non-pharmaceutical biomanufacturing, and that's out of the Department of Defense. And so the consortium will invite industry speakers to come and talk to us. And Christopher, this probably echoes with you. This is a moving target. It's a rapidly changing field, and you have to keep up to date. If you don't partner with companies, you're going to fall behind. You don't want your curriculum to be stale.
No, absolutely. That really does resonate.
And that I just want to add, in terms of, I don't think Sujin was able to ask the question. So her question was, what policies or practices can help bridge this so all stakeholders are aligned and reap benefits? And I want to say one of the things that our system is pivoting to is we see everything that our system is doing contributing to a student's career mobility. So making sure that employers understand that and support that is really important. I think that any policy recommendation that comes out would require employers be engaged with community colleges and helping to ensure that we are all focused on the needs of a community that we are in. Because as community colleges, we can't do it alone. We need employers to be just as committed to that work as we are. And just to share an example of a policy change, and actually it's a regulation change that we are currently making, is we are updating the work experience regulations. Those are currently under review. They go for final reading this month. And our focus is around students and their needs. We want to have a well-trained workforce. And if we want to do that, we need to ensure that students get access to experiential learning opportunities similar to nursing programs. Most employers prefer to hire individuals with prior work experience. So how do we do this together to facilitate this for all students, not just a select few or career technical education students? And so the goal in updating those regulations is around creating and facilitating experiential learning and work experience in general for all students who come through our system. And so really excited about those changes coming forward and what it means for our faculty to have closer engagement with business and industry and supporting our students' career mobility. So, and of course, thinking of it from the framework of we have both an enrollment shortage and a workforce shortage. And so facilitating those conversations, working together to solve this problem that affects us all is really important.
I would just like to add, I know Chris mentioned earlier that there is quite a time investment to train an employee who comes to you who has a degree and they have experience, but they might not have that specialized experience. That's definitely something that we see in the healthcare system as well. Many nursing students receive the same education across the board, and then it's really that hospital that takes on the student and can specialize their training to whatever unit or department that's needed. And another thing that I've seen that works really well is that nursing students on campus, we organize career fairs specific to nursing at Sac State. We'll bring, Sutter, UC Davis, Stanford, Kaiser, the VA. We've had the Navy come as well, and to talk with these nursing students. Some students aren't even in the nursing program, they're just interested in the healthcare field. And that's a direct way for these employers to, provide them with information on maybe not a nursing position, but maybe an entry-level position that will get them their foot into the door of the healthcare system. And it's really that, on the ground, reaching out to these students at campus, getting that relationship built leads to a lot of success for students.
Yeah, kind of two different points there I wanted to chime in on. Sandra, going back to some of your comments, I think there's a huge opportunity here for community colleges, especially in training the next generation of cybersecurity professionals. There's a lot of what we do that doesn't really require a four-year degree. And I know that in the past, I think employers go through these cycles where hiring managers can't always identify the skills they need. So they end up using degrees or certificates as a proxy for skill evaluation. And I'll be the first to admit that evaluating skills is a lot of work, and not everybody is really invested in doing that. But for myself personally, I've never required degrees. I've never required certificates, because you automatically cut out a lot of potential candidates from there. I think as we've been seeing these shortages, I'm seeing a lot more employers that are willing to accept candidates that maybe don't have the full bachelor's degree or on a path to one. But I really think a lot of what we do, from an operations standpoint, and I'd be talking here specifically to the entry-level security jobs, there's really no reason that candidates or students couldn't learn those skills within an 18 or 24-month program and come and be very, very successful. Then the other question I had is actually back to you, Colton. I was interested in hearing what your experience was from the student or applicant side from an internship. This is the first year I've actually had an intern in my entire career. I'm very fortunate that our company, the talent acquisition department, very, very much supported a formal internship program. I believe we've hired over 20 across the company. So a lot of that support was there, but I know a lot of companies don't have that support, and it's been challenging. It's been challenging at other companies to find anybody that'll even support an intern. The candidate that we selected, we whittled her down out of 50 applicants. She's absolutely amazing, and I know she's going to develop into an incredible talent. What was your experience like, and what could we do to kind of help, help bridge that gap too? I would love to be able to partner with the local California or regional California colleges and universities to identify people, maybe around their junior year, help work to get them into a summer internship, even continue that internship over their final year, and then really have a student that is vetted, has had some skills, has had their formal education, has had the informal education, has had the work experience. That to me, like a slow motion hire develop, would be just fantastic. I just don't know how to get there.
Yes. I think one thing the healthcare field does particularly well for students is that it's not necessarily Kaiser Permanente interviewing me, but they're receiving letters of rec from my faculty. We're applying through Sac State, through our institution, and Kaiser allocates a certain amount of students, each summer for their internship program at different hospitals in California. But they're really relying on the university to do that, that groundwork, that vetting of students, picking out students from their own selection, and then giving these, these enterprises, these hospitals, these institutions, the best candidates already, so that, you as an employer are picking from, the best selection possible. That's something that they do. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but we can speak more later.
No, it really does, and I think that's really key for a successful internship program. With our program here, the recruiters actually went out. It was employer outward, right? So all the employer had a dedicated recruiter on this, and they recruited similar as they would for any regular job. But that's a really high level of effort, and not all companies are willing, or frankly, not all companies can afford to spend that amount of effort. So I think some of the work you said, especially with the union, the nurses union there, of taking some of that burden off the employers, I think is really, really key. Not that employers should have a totally free ride, but I think anything that makes it a little easier, it works out better for everybody.
Definitely, yeah.
I wanted to mention that we always have to remember that the economic development of California echoed from investments, especially in the 1950s, in higher education. We're the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world, depending on how you look at it. But really, that came right from investments in higher education that were intentionally made really by our predecessors. And that continues to today. Out of Sandra's office, the strong workforce monies have been very valuable in the development of especially career technical education programs. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that community colleges have a opportunity and a structure that isn't available to our brethren in the universities. That, for example, I'm sitting in a $34 million brand new biotech training facility that was funded by local bond monies. And so colleges, many of the community colleges have brand new science buildings that were funded by going out to the local taxpayers and asking the local taxpayers to tax themselves, to add $10 a year on their property taxes. And then the community colleges have taken that and used that to build facilities and to buy equipment. And so the investments continue. And I think these investments are important for, again, both workforce and economic development.
Thank you for that, Jim. I absolutely agree. I think that the legislature having the foresight to fund a strong workforce to the levels that it's currently funded, I think it's 3 or 4 times the federal investment that we have in strong workforce dollars. And those dollars are designed to make sure that our colleges can be responsive to employer needs, but also to student needs and their needs for career mobility. And so how do we leverage those in a much more meaningful way? And I think that we do a lot already with those dollars. I know that we can do more. I think, Chris, in terms of your connections, I'm sad to hear that you haven't had the most positive of experiences, because I mean, in my experience, I worked really well with our employers, and it sounds like Jim had really positive experiences as well. So I think that there's more, obviously, that we can always do to leverage that funding, but know that that funding is there to support employer engagement, but also to support how our colleges respond to the needs of business industry, but also students. And so making sure that we create those opportunities and facilitate experiential learning as well as internships is critical, but also part of that mission of those strong workforce dollars is our job is to make sure that students have access to employment when they complete. And we were really focused on those employment outcomes. And so anytime we can get an employer on board to support that mission, we are first at the table, because we do have resources for that. So maybe if you need a direct contact, happy to find that person for you, and make sure that you have that connection, so that you are building the partnerships that you need. But like I said earlier, like the system can't do it alone. We can take it so far, and then, employers got to step in and help us, especially when we talk about experiential learning for students. Like, there's no better place than in an actual work environment to get that experience. And so employers have to be willing to take on a mentee, take on an apprentice, right? Take on an intern. And like you said, it's your first time doing it in I don't know how many years you've been in the workforce, but it shouldn't be your first time, right? This should be like a common practice that we have for all of our students to have access to those opportunities. And to Jim's point earlier, how we improve the outcomes, the equity outcomes, is by making sure that those hard to serve, underserved populations that come to our system are able to build that social professional capital that helps them then elevate to that next level. And so how do we facilitate that? And like I said, part of the work that we're doing is around updating our own regulations to make sure that we are not part of the problem, but we're part of the solution. And so hopefully employers like yourself will be a part of that change that we're trying to make.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I will say this is a very heartening conversation to have because, you know, I listened to you, I listened to James, and what you were describing is exactly what I think I'm looking for. A lot of other hiring managers are looking for as well. It's really a matter of, hey, the product's there, the buyers are there. How do you get the products in front of the buyers? You know, to use kind of a coarse analogy, but I think that's a much more solvable problem than if the product wasn't there in the first place.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn, the communications director at California Competes. I'm going to step in really quick and pose the last question for our panel. For institutions looking to demonstrate the impact of their relationship with employers, what are some suggested metrics and measures to assess employer relations?
Let me mention that every career technical education program has to have a industry advisory board that meets every 6 months. And so we use that to sort of put our finger on the pulse of what's happening in the industry. And so that's really the first metric to make sure that we do that outreach. My experience is that companies are always very willing to provide advice and interact with us, except you have to keep the doors open and you have millions of dollars at stake. And so whenever I talk to corporate leaders, they have a full recognition that they have to engage with higher education in order to provide the workforce of the future. But today I've got the following 5 fires to put out. And then tomorrow I've got 5 more fires. So yeah, I'll get back to you. But you know, today I can't because it's just crazy. And so anyway, I've always sensed the willingness of industry to engage with higher education, but sometimes it's difficult just because of the mechanics of what they're doing. And I like what you put on the screen. There are different cultures between higher education and industry, and we try to bridge that. I'm not sure that the values are all that different, but we try to work around the structure of higher education, which I know for industry can be frustrating, but we can quickly devise a program that caters to industry. And I think the stereotype of higher education moving slowly is not really true.
I'd also say the stereotype of private industry moving quickly is not always true.
There's one just last question that came in. What can higher ed apprenticeship managers make it easier on the employers to take on apprentices?
Yeah, so I'd go back to what Colton was saying about what I really liked about the way you're describing the program was that you know there was some effort made and some work done to help us reduce the amount of time it takes to kind of vet candidates. Having pre-vetted candidates, I think, is really good. You know, in the case of the of my intern here, you know, they got over it was close to 500 resumes. Out of that, they brought it down to 50. I looked at over 25 of those resumes, ended up interviewing 10 and went all the way down to 1. And I was willing to make the investment because I think it's very, very important. And I'm committed to, you know, identifying and boosting talent, but it's not really scalable. So there is a partnership. You know, James, you made the point that there's got to be work on each side. And I 100% agree and I'm on board with that. Anything that can make it, you know, more palatable to organizations to help reduce the burden of identifying candidates. One of the hardest things is we can't really evaluate on skills. So we're strictly evaluating on, you know, drive, on personality, and on, you know, some of the most critical things I look for are attention to detail and the ability to really critically focus on one thing, but then be able to go out and go back and fight multiple fires and do that repeatedly. It's very, very hard to ascertain that from just interviews from somebody that doesn't have any work experience. When I look at a resume that has a lot of education on it, it's good and there's a lot of knowledge there, but will this employee have the ability to come in and be successful with the multiple shifting priorities, with the rapidly changing deadlines, with all the things that kind of come up? If you have work experience, I can look and I can ask questions around that. If there's no work experience, I'm kind of making a leap on faith. So there's a lot of risk there. So anything that I think educational side can do to help reduce that risk to employers is really, really, really valuable and worthwhile. I would love to see, like letters of recommendation from faculty, letters, because that goes a long way for me. I know that, faculty will have a lot more, a lot more experience, a lot more kind of outwardly in viewpoints of the candidates. So that kind of stuff is incredibly valuable to me.
What we try to do in higher education, to your point, is we try to make our classroom experience as close to the corporate experience that the students are going to go to as possible. For example, our labs are 8 to 5, and during our summer boot camp, our labs are 8 to 5 every day, and you had better be on time. And if you're not on time, you had better have contacted me and contacted your teammates and have arranged for it. It's okay to be sick, but it's not okay to be sick and just not show. And so the closer that we can come to the corporate environment, the better. We run shifts. And so I have students come in for graveyard shift at midnight because the cells have to be fed. And if you can't do that, maybe this is not the field for you. So.
No, that's absolutely amazing, and I love that you're doing that. Hopefully, your labs aren't as dysfunctional as some companies I've been in. But I will say that knowing that, being able to articulate that back to employers, that just goes so far and gives me so much comfort in knowing that, hey, here's a candidate that they're coming in, they've got the knowledge, they've got the drive, they might not have the technical skill yet, but they have experienced it. They have experienced some hands-on stuff. They have experienced all the intangibles that make up working and thriving in a corporate environment. Knowing that would just be absolutely huge to me from an employer standpoint.
The other thing that students often undervalue is the terrible jobs that they've had in their past. So our bartenders do really well because they've seen people not at their best. But my students come out of retail and my students come out of fast food, and they have had to take customers being mean to them. They've had to multitask. They've had to do record keeping. They've had to work in teams, and students often undervalue all of that experience. And I try to remind them that was really valuable for you, because when employers talk about soft skills or workplace skills, that's where you develop them.
Oh, absolutely. When we talk about the ability to remain calm or perform under pressure, I can't think of any job I was ever more pressured than when I was making tacos at Taco Bell, 35 years ago.
All right, well, thank you. We are a little past our 12 o'clock end time. So I just wanted to thank Sandra, Chris, Colton, and James for joining us for this conversation today. And for those who want more information, feel free to reach out. The brief can be found on our website at www.californiacompetes.org. And so, yeah, I will leave you to your afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you
for the opportunity.
Thank you.